So we would like to hear from the tables. If you have a question for the panel, that would be great. If you have a comment, that's fine too. We do want you to keep your question or comment to approximately 1 minute, which would be shorter than the question I tried to pose at the beginning as I was trying to figure out what my question was. But maybe we'll start with the young people over here. Comment or a question for the panel. Where did you go in your conversation?
Karina, how are you?
Oh, and Dr. McCarthy knows, Murphy knows you.
You can choose. Anybody?
One of the starting points of our conversation was talking about experiences of power and love and intimacy and sex. And one of the questions that I had is that, are those experiences limited to committed relationships / marriage? Because I don't necessarily think that, experiences of power, love, intimacy, and sex is limited to committed relationships. And I think those can happen in safe and consensual relationships outside of marriage. Yeah, I just wonder, if that's something we need to consider. Yeah, just how y'all would respond to that.
And this is why I'm glad I'm the moderator and I'm not answering the questions today.
Oh, and you're passing, you're punting. I think that question in Catholic theology is new. Oh, yeah. I mean, for most, it has been a lot. Well, certainly the default has been marriage, and but there's been some conversation about pre-ceremonial sex or sex in committed relationships. I'm aware of a dissertation being written right now that has to do with less committed relationships and good sex in those relationships, but it's very new. I don't know. I would have to say that I would be suspicious and cautious just based on the sociological data. There's a lot of not so great data out there right now about what's going on and a lot of low satisfaction, especially for women. I'm thinking of Lisa Wade's work on American hookup culture, but other sex researchers as well. So I don't know that we have a lot of great data saying that that's possible. And I think there's some wisdom in the teaching of Humanae Vitae and other documents on the link between the valuing the dignity and valuing the relationship and valuing the commitment. But I think it's a live question, especially among Catholics and especially among younger Catholics, that we can't ignore.
Yeah, actually, I do want to follow up. I think it's interesting that you say that. Like, of course, it's a new theological question, but I don't know if that's necessarily a new social question, and we've been exploring that for ages. I just think that, like, I don't know how to put this. Sure, there might be data that, that sex outside of committed relationships has led to certain different things, but I don't think the lack of a committed relationship necessitates, sexual violence or bad sex, like you said. I think that, those things are rooted in what Rebecca was saying about the deeply rooted patriarchal culture that the church itself is situated in and society is also situated in. So I just hesitate to attribute, bad experiences to the lack of a committed relationship. Again, in a safe and consensual environment, I believe that those experiences still happen. So I'm just curious how you'd respond to that. Like, are we paying attention to, that deeply rooted patriarchal ideas that are influencing,
Oh, I think that's really important, and that's not something that, Humanae Vitae paid enough attention to, and it's not something Catholic sexual ethics has paid enough attention to, and that's a huge part of the problem, for sure. I think I would, you want to get in? No, and I would just say, I agree, we need to pay attention and think about, because, essentially, married couples who use contraception are raising a similar question, right? They're saying, isn't it possible that we can realize the values even with a different structure, right? Even so, and you're raising a similar question that I think it's important for us to engage.
So, very provocative, important question. Two quick things about it. How sure can somebody be in a non-committed relationship that they are in fact safe and that the sex is in fact consensual? So that's one question I had. I'm sure there are exceptions, but it strikes me that one could be far more certain about the fact that they were safe or that the sex was truly consensual in the context of a committed relationship. Second, it's a question that really is facilitated by the fact we no longer think of sex as being related to openness to procreation, seems to me. We might say, well, one could just contracept and then there won't be abortions as a result of this, but the data shows that about half of all procured abortions take place from a sexual relationship in which contraception is being used. And also, then we have to ask the question, if one doesn't have an abortion, what are children owed? If sex is in fact connected to procreation in the way that I think it is, the way that Humanae Vitae assumes it is, the way that the church assumes that it is, I think we have to start asking that question too. Are children owed a committed relationship, or at least in the context of thinking about this, should we think about this being best for children? And should their concern be part of what we think about?
Rebecca?
I want to preface this by saying I agree with what both Julie and Charlie have said, but I do want to contextualize the question in the history of literature, because literature gives us a safe place for talking about this without having to commit to whether we believe this is always true or false. And two things the history of literature show us. First of all, as I said earlier, that from the very beginning, so much of the sex that's been celebrated in erotic literature was predatory on women. And if you've read Kate Millett's Sexual Politics, you can see how so much of the sexual revolution was really men glorying in their power over women. But at the same time, we have, I'll point to two stories. One is Chekhov's story, The Woman with the Dog, in which a horrible guy seduces a vulnerable woman and ends up mysteriously falling in love with her. And against all odds, the two of them have a really genuine connection. And people read this story and they're like, but this isn't possible, he was using her. The other one I'm thinking of is Graham Greene's novel, The End of the Affair. It's an extramarital affair, they shouldn't be doing it, and yet this ends up becoming the place where grace comes in. And what poetry shows us is irony, and the irony of grace, so that I don't ever want to say it's impossible for this kind of a relationship to yield grace, unless there's violence, unless there's a clear attack on human dignity. So I don't know whether it's easier to have this conversation if we talk about stories, because then we can say, well, this is still just something that someone made up.
I'm not answering the questions. Not to disagree with the panel, but to take the student side just for 1 second too. Data is interesting, but of course the data is being collected in a patriarchal culture, right? And so, which doesn't give an easy answer to the question, but it's not like patriarchy ended in 1965 or 2005 right? So it's a complicating factor, but.
Over here, this table.
People can volunteer instead of being called on. Oh, good. We have a volunteer.
So a dialogue on the pages of the Washington Post between George Will and Ruth Marcus. Ruth Marcus came out as saying that she would have aborted had she had a Down syndrome child, and George Will has a Down syndrome child. And so they've each done 2 essays. It seems they're being positioned as a conversation. And it sort of relates to Iceland, where there are now 0 births of Down syndrome children. They're all being aborted. And so it seems to me that, I guess the question is this, and I think it's particularly to Julie, because she talked about the need for pro-life people to sort of reframe, and I think all 3 of you would agree, to reframe, and yet it seems like pro-life people are asked to reframe in a period in which they feel extremely embattled, when the zeitgeist is 100% against them, and now they can't even say abortion's wrong, because that's stigmatizing. So even if they give up on the political thing and retrench to, but it's wrong, but it's violent, that is being stigmatized as well. So in a setting where they feel more and more put upon, how is that likely to bring about a situation where they're going to be more open to reframing?
I know Charlie's commented more on this story and followed it more closely than I have. Yeah, but I mean, I have found in conversations, and I think there's some evidence, that when you can give something or put something off the table, say, can we just talk about this, right? There can be a different kind of progress. You are right, though. I mean, we're in this very difficult moment. And yeah, pro-life people, myself included, might feel like there isn't really space to give anymore, right? But I would say Marcus has gotten a lot of criticism too, right? And it's brought forward a lot of people who are saying, well, oh no, I don't want to be associated with that, right?
Yeah, I think also that debate points to an area of common ground that I think we can find, and that's in trying to relate the conversation to one surrounding ableism as just a broad phenomenon in our culture more generally. And so I have some success anyway in trying to reach across ideological divides by saying, okay, you might not be for a constitutional amendment to ban abortion, but what about sex selection abortions? What about abortion in the case of Down syndrome? What about men and partners and fathers coercing abortions? Can we get? There have been laws to try to do all those things. They've all been shot down. So I see a new moment with younger people, especially, to say this isn't a binary life choice thing. That's a hopelessly simplistic framework for thinking about this. Abortion is so wildly complex. I don't know why anybody would ever do that unless it's for political reasons or just shorthand or something. But if you start thinking about sexism and ableism and classism and violence as part of what's happening, I feel like that opens doors that might otherwise not be open. And maybe the Ruth Marcus, I was glad, I'm not glad Ruth Marcus has that position, but in some ways I was very glad that she brought this up, because we need to speak about this openly and honestly.
You know, it's my job to keep us on time. As grateful as I am to you, Therese, but my ultimate job as director to we are at 6:30, so I do want to also use that just for one more observation. I saw your hand go up. Is it a quick observation, or please just speak your mind.
My question was that we were all talking about pro-life versus pro-choice, and Rebecca, I loved your comment about pro-liveliness, and I think that validates everything that is spirit-driven and basically Christian. And I think if we could all get an idea of what good liveliness is, it would be lovely. That would be a great discussion. Thank you so much.
And if I can close with one comment to thank Mike Murphy, because this was really great on many levels. Both the panelists' comments and your conversation. This must be like Humanae Vitae month or something, because recently on Twitter I saw that another Catholic university that shall remain nameless, that I have a degree from, also had a conversation on Humanae Vitae. And it was a culture war triumphalist account of Humanae Vitae. And the Hank Center does a beautiful job of creating real conversations about really complicated, interesting theological, sociological, and political issues. So Mike is our new director, and I think you are continuing the legacy of the Hank Center in the conversation you put on today. So thank you.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Let's give our.
Thank you. Very kind. There's also a conference in Catholic University on April 5th, I think a 3-day one. So you can consider that. I do want to thank you again for coming. Again, our next event is Massimo Fagioli and some respondents. Massimo is professor at Villanova University, the university that we are going to beat for the national title very soon. Go with God, people, and all blessings to you. Thanks very much for coming.